And thanks for joining us on apparently the hottest day of the year so far in Washington. I'm Vikram Singh. I'm the Vice President for National Security and International Policy here at the Center for American Progress. And we're really glad to have everyone. I know headlines are grabbing everyone's attention minute by minute, and it's hard to lift your head up from Twitter. But one of the most consequential things that will happen in the next few years is going to be what the United States chooses to do with its nuclear arsenal. Nuclear modernization is a must. We need to maintain a credible deterrent. But we are now looking at a potential $1 trillion spend, and we're looking at some moves in terms of modernization and the introduction of new systems and weapons that could either prove stabilizing or destabilizing. In a way, we're sort of entering a new nuclear age. As somebody who grew up with movies like The Day After and worries about that, I'm hoping my 3-year-old doesn't find his high school years again an era of worrying about nuclear conflict. So I'm really grateful for Representative Adam Smith, the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, for joining us today to kick off what should be a really good discussion on this terrific report. Thankful to Dr. Adam Mount for making this happen and to the Plowshares Fund for funding this. This report is based on a war game we did here at CAP last year with a bipartisan group of nuclear experts. It did not make anyone have a good night's sleep through the course of doing that war game, and it really tees up well the kinds of questions we need to ask. So we have a terrific panel. Representative Smith is known to everybody in this room. He's a leader not only on national security issues writ large, but specifically on nuclear issues. He wrote recently in Foreign Policy about his concern and about why he was introducing into the NDAA some requirements to force the administration to be transparent about what its plans are going to be for modernizing the nuclear force. He said, while we need a credible nuclear deterrent, this plan that's currently envisioned could actually, quote, undermine U.S. security by driving an emerging global nuclear arms race, unquote. So we're worried about weakening non-proliferation and weakening our deterrent even as we're modernizing nuclear forces. The stakes really couldn't be any higher, and I'm really just pleased that you all could join us, and thank you, Representative Smith, for your leadership and for coming to talk to us for a little bit. And I know you have to get out for votes, so we'll try to get some Q&A in.
Appreciate it. Well, thank you. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate the work that CAP has done on this and many, many other issues. I think it's an incredibly important think tank. I've enjoyed working with Vikram, and obviously his knowledge base is broad on a wide range of subjects, so a real asset to have him here. I think one of the most important things he said, which I'll mention just quickly and then get into the nuclear modernization debate, is the new nuclear arms race. And in fact, I introduced legislation trying to come up with a strategy to deal with Russia. And part of it is countering what we know of their cyber, their disinformation campaigns, messing with elections and all of that. But one little piece of it was the importance of opening up dialogue like we had certainly near the end of the Cold War, so that you lowered the risk of accidentally stumbling into a nuclear war. And I actually met with former Secretary Perry yesterday, who talked a lot about this issue and has written a book about it. So it's strange. We're all concerned about the way that President Trump is talking with Vladimir Putin, and we, well, should be, because we're not sure exactly what's going on there. But ironically, what we do need is we do need some channel of communication between us and the Russians to try to make sure that there are no miscalculations that stumble us into a nuclear war, and that also we can begin to understand the importance of containing the amount of nuclear weapons that we build. These were all things that sort of came about slowly during the Cold War, but then were a critical element of making sure that we didn't go over the brink and actually live the day after. I remember that movie as well. Gave me nightmares for weeks, actually. So I think that's one important piece. But when it comes to nuclear modernization, I'm going to start off in kind of an unexpected place, just to let you know a little bit on what goes on the Armed Services Committee, and particularly the last 6 months. Basically, generals and think tank people come over and talk to us, and scare the hell out of us and tell us how far behind we are on absolutely everything, how much more money we need for, deterring North Korea, for dealing with Russia, for dealing with China, for dealing with Iran, for dealing with terrorism. We're behind on absolutely everything. Now, how it is that we can outspend these people so dramatically over the course of 20 years and wind up behind in absolutely every conceivable area, I don't know. But the point is, the message that's been driven home is panic, and you have to give us more money. Now, I understand that. That's part of what everybody does in Washington, D.C., depending on what your interest is. What is really troubling about this is the absence of a strategy, is the absence of, okay, here's all of our needs, here's the resources we reasonably think we're going to have, here are our priorities. That's what has not been done. And this is troubling on two levels. Number one, it means that the money that we're spending, is it even really making us more safe? Is it the best use of that money? But two, and most troubling to me, is that it does not put us in the position to live comfortably in the world of finite resources that we have. There seems to be this opinion within the Armed Services Committee that somehow all of this money is going to magically appear. And both of those things are problematic, because if you look at what they're talking about, we, quote, need, unquote, for national security, forget $700 billion. I mean, my goodness, you could add it. You'd probably get up to $1 trillion a year to meet all of the needs that they come over and tell us about. And they don't know how to prioritize them. And then, of course, there's the tiny little fact that we don't actually have even $700 billion, much less $1 trillion. All of this is important when we talk about nuclear modernization, because the question that is so rarely asked and absolutely never answered is, what can we do without? What are we spending money on at the Pentagon that we shouldn't be spending money on? Because if we can't answer those questions, we're basically screwed if you believe what they're telling us, which is that we don't have enough money to protect ourselves. So let's just cross our fingers and hope for the best. I don't happen to believe that. I happen to think that in a defense budget of even $600 billion, our nation ought to be able to meet our national security needs if we are intelligent about how we do it, if we use partners throughout the world to help meet our national security needs, and if we get to a better place. But one thing that I do firmly believe is when you're looking at all of the different areas that we're told that we need to spend money on, the one place where we can save money the most clearly is on nuclear modernization, by having a better deterrent strategy. And I always use, China has a very good example, and forgive me, I know there's a much more sophisticated way to put this, and people have written detailed reports about it, but the way I always put it is China has enough nuclear weapons to basically say, don't screw with us, because if you do, we can obliterate you. They don't get into all these scenarios of, oh gosh, what if they took out all of our weapons in a first strike that somehow we didn't see coming? Then we'd need a whole lot more weapons, but then what if we fired those and they fired these? So, at the end of the day, we need 50,000 nuclear weapons. We really don't. What we need is a strong, credible deterrent. That's basically what nuclear weapons are for, is to ensure your security by saying, if you attack us, we will have enough that you will wish you hadn't, which, by the way, ought to be our strategy on North Korea. And do we need a full nuclear modernization to do that? Now, they will tell you how far we've come down in terms of the number of nuclear weapons that we've had, and that's true, but we had way crazy too many in the first place. So I think a more focused strategy on having a credible deterrent for our adversaries, and then using diplomacy and the other tools of foreign policy to avoid the conflicts in the first place, is a much better way to go, regardless almost of how much money we had. But if you then take the step back and see the concerns about how are we going to deter North Korea to have are we going to have enough ships to have a sufficient deterrent in the South, in that part of the world? Are we going to have a big enough army, a big enough Marine Corps? Are we going to be able to develop our cyber capabilities and continue our special operations efforts to deter terrorism? If you look at it in that context, it's downright stupid to waste all of this money on nuclear modernization. There is much better ways to do it. Unfortunately, everyone is protecting every little piece of it. Personally, I think we need to look at whether or not the triad still makes sense. Do we need the ICBMs, for instance? Submarines and nuclear-capable bombers are very strong deterrents. We could save an enormous amount of money in this area. And what I'm concerned about is that the nuclear modernization plan right now is saying we got to rebuild everything and ramp up and get back into an arms race with Russia. So I think we need a better approach. Now, one of the things we've tried to do as Democrats on the committee is point out how much this is going to cost. That's an okay strategy. The problem is, it is true that when you're projecting costs over 20 or 30 years, it's very, very difficult to calculate them. Though based on my experience in 20 years on the Armed Services Committee with things like the F-35 and the Ford Carrier, which was finally launched, it's going to be higher. Always take the over, basically, if you have the opportunity to bet on that. So, whatever your number is, it's probably going to be more than that. So we really need to focus on having a limited nuclear deterrent that meets our national security objectives and fits our budget. And it's important for two reasons. Number one, I think it will give us a more stable world and a better national security posture. And two, because it will help us deal with the rather enormous problem that we have in this country, that we are massively in debt and it's only getting worse. I will reserve the rest of the time to answer your questions and then have to rush off to vote, but happy to take those questions.
I'm going to come up and join you up here. If you want to come out in front of the podium, we can do that, or I'll just stand here and call on people. So go ahead. Any questions? We've got about 5 minutes, so we can probably do four questions or so. Yes, sir.
With an agreement with your opinion about how China is handling its deterrence. And I just wonder, how did they do that politically? Is it such a different political system in China that they're able to control their military-industrial complex? Or did they thoughtfully realize that that's an appropriate way to handle deterrence?
I don't know for sure. I mean, China did have the advantage of not being engaged in a 60-year Cold War or 50-year Cold War with the Soviet Union and all the back and forth paranoia that went into that. But also, yes, I think they are better able to control their military-industrial complex. It's, I guess, one of the advantages of a dictatorship. No one's going to accuse you of having a missile gap and then beat you in the next election. So I think they were able to have a more rational approach to it. And to be fair, and to make sure that I don't sound naive here, I understand that China has a different set of concerns and a different set of issues. They don't have as many adversaries as we do and as many things to be concerned about. But that sort of misses the point on the strength of nuclear weapons and what they can accomplish. So those are the reasons I would give for why China was able to do that. But ultimately, I think one of them is they made a better decision. And we need to look at that and learn from it.
Thank you. I'm at Diane Perlman at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. So first of all, I was pleased to hear that you mentioned about avoiding conflicts in the first place, and that there's a lot of knowledge and skill on reducing tension and working on transforming conflicts, which kind of get eclipsed when you're focused on superficial pressure rather than analyzing the underlying, dealing with the reasons and what the parties want and need for the underlying conflict. Second, deterrence is a theory, and it breaks down under certain conditions, and there's also a body of literature on spiral theory, and sometimes when you act according to deterrence, you provoke escalation. And third, it doesn't address nukes getting into the hands of non-state actors. And I was at the Nuclear Ban Treaty meeting in the UN just the last few weeks, which did not, U.S. boycotted and which did not get reported much in the news, if at all. So I'd like your comments about that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And part of the dialogue that I envision us opening up with Russia and hopefully with China is to prohibit that arms race, number one, and number two, to work together on non-proliferation, to stop non-state actors from acquiring nuclear weapons, to limit the growth of the number of countries that have nuclear weapons. And we have worked very well together in the past. It's one of many unfortunate aspects of the way Russia went after the Soviet Union. There was a great opportunity there for the two great post-World War II powers to join together to confront global problems through mutual interest. And I won't walk through all the different things that made that fall apart. There's plenty of blame to go along, but certainly it was a lost opportunity. And, well, was lost opportunity, but we also did make a lot of progress. I mean, in the early years when we were working together after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we destroyed a lot of nuclear material and worked with the Russians to consolidate their nuclear arsenal in certain places and to stop proliferation. And there were a number of efforts by rogue scientists and others to sell nuclear material to the highest bidder, and we worked together on that. I don't see any reason why we can't continue to work together on that, even if we have our differences in other areas. So that's what I mean by, we really need to work on a dialogue here. We have to be able to work with the other nuclear powers in the world for containment. And it's a lot more complicated than it was during the Cold War, but the basic principles of an open line of communications and an effort to deter that, I think, are the same.
Right here in the fourth row back.
Greg Thielman on the board of the Arms Control Association. Thank you very much, Congressman, for coming today and also for your efforts on the Hill. I noticed that you did not have any explicit mention of missile defense, which is clearly part of the strategic equation, a very costly program. And what I want to focus on is strategic missile defense and get your views on what our general approach should be to this, because no matter how much we explain to ourselves that we're only defending ourselves against a currently non-existent Iranian ICBM and potentially a North Korean ICBM, the Russians and the Chinese react differently, and it seems to fuel their offensive programs that threaten us and reduce their willingness to negotiate lower limits on arms control.
Yeah, that's part of the the scenario for why you need 50,000 nuclear weapons is what if they. But look, missile defense against nuclear weapons is of limited value. And I do think, and you probably know a lot more about this than I do, so I'm going to get myself in a bit of trouble here. If you're talking about stopping one rogue missile that's coming at you, it's going to be tough, but you may have a chance with an adequate, anti-ballistic missile defense system. But if you're talking about all the sophisticated nuclear weapons that exist now, missile defense is borderline meaningless. I mean, on a clear day, when we know it's coming, we can hit one warhead. All the things that are now built into these warheads in terms of multiple warheads coming out, different ways to basically confuse whatever the missile is that's coming at you, there's no way you can count on missile defense as a guarantee that you're not going to be hit, particularly if you're talking about even a dozen nuclear weapons. So I don't think missile defense is as destabilizing as Russia and others, might try to sort of beat their chest and claim that it is. But again, this is something that we should talk about, and we should make sure that our missile defense system does focus on North Korea and Iran. And I do realize that we've had those conversations. China was still upset about us putting the THAAD systems into South Korea, which, diplomatically, I think we ought to be able to explain to them, are you kidding me? Are you not seeing what North Korea is doing? Do you not know that this is clearly what we're doing this for? Not, to prevent you from launching nuclear weapons at South Korea or Japan or whatever. So I think that comes back into diplomacy. And I will make the point that while we're spending all this money on the defense budget and cutting the State Department by a third, that doesn't make it easier. And it also doesn't make it easier that we seem to have two separate diplomatic channels in the current White House. One is whatever Donald Trump feels like on a given day, and then the other is what everybody else is doing. And the two don't really have much to do with each other. In case after case after case, we've seen Secretary Tillerson or Secretary Mattis say one thing and then Trump say the exact opposite the next day. They've got to get that organized so we have a cohesive diplomatic approach. They can help us with issues like, can we put a THAAD system into South Korea to help protect against the North Korea threat? Can we continue our West Coast missile defense that we're building in Alaska? What are levels that are acceptable that won't cause us to stumble into an arms race with Russia or China? Those are the types of things that diplomats did. And I will say that, throughout the Cold War, and particularly near the end with Ronald Reagan's proposed Star Wars and all that stuff, SDI defense system and everything, we managed to work that out. even in what I think was a much more difficult, a much more complicated environment. But we have to try, and the current administration is not trying. That's what's most concerning to me.
One last question. You have to promise to make it short. Look to the gentleman right next to that. Last question.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much. I got a question. On one hand, we have NPR nuclear posture review, which is conducted by administration, and on another hand, we have NDAA bill, which is discussed in the Congress, and this bill, as I can see, it includes some of the limitations on bilateral cooperation between U.S. and Russia in terms of arms control. And I wonder how do these processes, NDA and NPR, coincide with each other? Do they move in the same direction, or it's two different, separate processes? Thank you. And by the way, I'm from Russian Embassy, Vyacheslav Koster. Thank you.
They move in the same direction because keep in mind, the NDAA is a piece of legislation. The president has to sign it in order for it to become law. And the nuclear posture review is an executive branch thing. So if we were to go rogue, if you will, in the NDAA and try to put in law all kinds of things that contradict the nuclear posture review, they could simply veto the bill. So it is a ongoing discussion between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And it's kind of difficult for us. They can get far out in front of us much more easily than we can get out in front of them. So it is a cooperative effort and not one where it could wind up being conflicting because, like I said, ultimately the executive branch has the trump card there.
The trump card is
Yeah,
no pun intended.
Didn't even occur to me as I was saying it. So, but well, thank you very much. I appreciate your work in this issue. Look forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming at such a busy time. Really appreciate it. All right. Thanks, everyone. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Adam Mount. Adam, come on up, and why don't you introduce the panel, and you guys get going.
Sorry to be late.
Thank you. My name is Adam Mount. I'm a senior fellow here at CAP. And I want to thank everyone for coming out on a warm day and for Congressman Smith for his remarks. We've got a great panel today for you to hear discussion on these issues. To my immediate right is Brian McKeon. Brian McKeon's most recent position was Acting Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Prior to that, he held my favorite title in the Department of Defense, Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, which is delightfully Baroque. Prior to that, he was Executive Secretary and Chief of Staff, National Security Council, Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden, and 12 years on the Democratic side of the Committee on Foreign Relations in the Senate. Lacey Healy is fellow with Stimson's Center for Budgeting on Foreign Affairs and Defense. She works on the U.S. budget process, on defense strategy, nuclear weapons proliferation. Prior to this, she was policy director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, where she worked on North Korea and other issues. And she also served as part of the Independent Sustainable Defense Task Force, formed in response to a request from Representative Barney Frank. And third to my right is Simon Lamage. Simon Lamage just previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nonproliferation at the State Department's ISN Bureau for 6 years, from 2011 to 2017. Prior to that, he was Chief of Staff for Ellen Tauscher, Undersecretary of State for Arms Control, and was Congressman Tauscher's Chief of Staff in the Senate. So thanks very much for joining me. Brian, I want to start with you and ask, part of what we did in compiling this report was we surveyed proposals for new nuclear weapons, which are proliferating at a pretty rapid rate. There was a proposal in the NDAA to establish a program of record for the INF for an intermediate-range nuclear-capable GLICM, ground-launched cruise missile, as a response to the INF treaty violation. At the same time, General Hyten, commander of STRATCOM, has said, our arsenal is sufficient to meet deterrent requirements. So I wanted to just ask you, does the current force structure meet our deterrent requirements? Is it in excess of deterrence requirements, or do we need new capabilities to meet new threats?
So let me separate the question a little bit, the INF piece and the broader strategic piece that General Hyten was no doubt talking about, which is our current strategic deterrent consisting of the three legs of the triad, the ICBM force, the submarine force, and the bomber force, along with the air-launched missile. All of those, as Congressman Smith talked about, face modernization. Another word that I would use would be recapitalization. The platforms of the triad are all aging out at the same time and need to be replaced at about the same time over the next 15 to 20 years. So that's an investment in recapitalizing the triad if the executive branch chooses to maintain a triad. The Obama administration looked at this a couple of times in the Nuclear Posture Review in 2010 and a review in 2013 and concluded we still needed to retain the triad. So I think what General Hyten was talking about is we need to recapitalize the triad. We don't need new, different types of warheads or new nuclear weapons to put on those platforms. The ones that we have in the arsenal that are being updated through life extension programs are sufficient. I think that's what General Hyten's position would be. Then the separate issue of whether the United States should develop and deploy a new ground-launched cruise missile to put in Europe in response to Russia's violation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty is a distinct question. It would be illegal to deploy it unless we were to withdraw from the treaty, but there's no prohibition on starting a program. We just couldn't test it. So once we test it, I believe that we would cross the limit on that. I think the view of the Pentagon when I was there up to 6 months ago today, and probably still today, although that may be changing because it's a different administration, is we don't need to deploy a new GLICM in Europe to counter Russia's INF violation. There are other ways that we can do that, and certainly trying to engage in a dialogue and bring them back into the treaty was the first best option that we were pursuing under President Obama.
Good. So let me ask you an additional question. Many of these proposals work on the following theory. Russia has a much more graduated and much more complex nuclear arsenal. They have more non-strategic weapons that they deploy in sort of recklessly closer to the front lines of a potential contingency. And so the theory is that if the United States doesn't have matching or symmetrical capabilities, it won't be able to control escalation as reliably in a limited war. So let me also read you something that Michelle Flournoy said to Arms Control Association recently. She personally believes that she would emphatically state that the purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter the use of other nuclear weapons. There's a benefit to declaring that we don't believe these weapons are for warfighting and that we stand in opposition and in contrast to countries like Russia who talk in a very cavalier manner about escalating to nuclear use in order to try to stop conventional war, which is incredibly irresponsible and incredibly dangerous. That is also a recommendation that we made in this report. Is that something you'd support? And more generally, how do we think about the role of non-strategic weapons in controlling limited conflicts?
So this is one of the key questions to look for in the Trump administration's nuclear posture review is, do they change the policy statements that were embraced by President Obama in the nuclear posture review in 2010? In that document, which is still available on the internet if you wish to go back and look at it, the administration of the day said that the fundamental role of nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attack on U.S. allies and partners, and that the United States would only consider the use of nuclear weapons other than that in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of U.S. allies and partners. And in addition, we strengthened what is known as the negative security assurance, in which we said and announced to the world that we would not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states that were part of the NPT and in compliance with their non-proliferation obligations. So that's the framework by which the administration announced it would consider the use of nuclear weapons, which squares with what Michelle Flournoy said. I think my view is, and I think I saw either General Hyten or General Selva said this in testimony in front of Mr. Smith's committee in the last few months, it's in the real world, it's hard to distinguish between strategic and non-strategic. Any use of nuclear weapons is a pretty big deal and is a strategic game changer. And so it's kind of an artificial term that we use in the field, but I don't see a great distinction. The Russian doctrine, as we understand it, seems to be that you could control escalation by, or the term that people use in translating the Russian is escalate to de-escalate. I think the view on this side of the water would be, and my old boss Bob Work, who just left the Pentagon, said this, use of nuclear weapon is the ultimate escalation, and we're kidding ourselves if you think you could manage the escalation by use of low-yield nuclear weapons. And by any president, including this one, I would hope, any commander of Strategic Command or U.S. European Command, they're going to pause long and hard. It's not going to be easier for them to use weapons just because they're non-strategic or low yield. That there's no need to do it in virtually all the conflicts we consider and plan for. We have a very robust and capable conventional force, and that was one of the things that President Obama very much wanted to emphasize, is reducing the role of nuclear weapons in our national security policy, relying on our advanced conventional technologies for the conflicts we could envision.
And there's nothing salient about the defense picture, the threat environment that has changed to change that element of the 2010 NPR?
Not in my view, no. But Russia and China are both embarked on military modernization, including of their nuclear forces, but I think the United States military, as Mr. Smith outlined, is well equipped for the threats of today and of tomorrow. And we are spending significant amounts of money to invest in that military, as he outlined. And I think we can continue on the course and the policy statements that are in place today. The administration may choose to change that.
Great. So you mentioned the cost of modernization. So Lacey, let me turn to you. We're just going through an NDAA process now. At the same time, the New York Times recently published a report that said the cost of the arsenal is rising to $1.2 trillion over 30 years. You heard Rep. Smith say, all of this money will magically appear, is the wish and the hope. Will it appear? Is it appearing? And what happens if it doesn't?
Yeah, that's a good question. Representative Smith rightly pointed to a problem between strategy and spending in the nuclear arsenal. And I would point out that that's a problem not just in the nuclear arsenal, but that's also a problem in the Pentagon and in our general strategy, and it's one that the Trump administration will have to deal with. Trump's proposals so far have been generally pretty clear, I would say, on the military as a whole. He'd like a much stronger, or not necessarily stronger, but larger conventional force, like 350 ship Navy, larger ground forces, a big buildup, and Congress. Some folks in Congress have supported that view, and some of the proposals that we're seeing are very, very high. There are a lot of road blockages in the way to getting that money, not just for nuclear weapons, but for the Defense Department as a whole. We have proposals in Congress right now for over $700 billion worth of spending. We're stuck, however, under current law, under the Budget Control Act caps, at a much lower number than that. And so if we want to put, about 550 of that in the base and really go crazy with war spending, just say, hey, war spending isn't war spending anymore, it's just extra Pentagon spending, then I suppose we could do that. We could add all of that money into that war account, and we could have a $700 billion top line. That's pretty unrealistic. The political reality in Congress is that Democrats and fiscal conservatives are going to push back on that, and it's not going to happen. So that brings us to the nuclear budget. When we're talking about trade-offs and fitting within our means and fitting within what we can actually spend under current law, we have to think about this $1.2 trillion over the next 30 years. We have to think about not what it looks like now, but what it's going to look like in the 2020s when it really ramps up. and it starts squeezing out all of that money for that 350-ship Navy that Trump says that he wants, and it starts squeezing out all of the money for everything else. And then we have to look at our strategy very closely and say, is this what we should be focusing on? Should we be focusing on a nuclear conflict? Is that what we're really worried about right now, when most of the U.S.'s traditional allies are playing in a very different field? We have a lot of gray zone conflict right now. We have sort of walking up to not overt war provocation, things that Russia and China are sort of most likely nuclear adversaries are doing are not in the nuclear realm. And so this is really very much a question of strategy and not just of spending.
So you've said over and over the question is about trade-offs between alternative military capabilities. Over and over we hear this argument that the nuclear triad, this 1.2 trillion figure, comprises only 5% of the Pentagon budget, 6%. What do you say to that kind of argument?
I mean, the Pentagon budget is huge. So first of all, 5% is quite a lot of money just on its face. Yeah. When you're talking about sort of what you can get for that amount of money in cyber capability or in conventional weaponry, it's quite a lot just to start out. Secondarily, we're also we're just talking about making these trade-offs moving forward under a budget in a budget-constrained environment. This is something that we don't have all the money in the world to spend, and Representative Smith pointed out, we could go trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars if we wanted to fight every contingency under the sun, and if we wanted to prepare for every contingency under the sun. I would point out that that's not just a strategy question and not just a spending question. That's also a strategy question when you're talking about focus and thinking about the most likely contingency. Spreading yourself thin, as in our own lives, spreading yourself thin, thinking about absolutely everything, is not always a good idea. Sometimes you need to take a very hard look at the future and make some trade-offs. So when we're talking about ramping up this money for nuclear spending, we see some very tangible things like the Navy asking to move that money to another part of the budget because, hey, it's just too much. We can't build the ships that we need to conduct regular operations and also spend this very massive amount of money on a new submarine. And so it goes to sort of from the big strategy questions down to just the day-to-day of trying to fit that in the budget.
So let me ask you, if the money does not materialize, what practically happens to the nuclear modernization program of record?
So my sense is that the money will in some way materialize. It may take longer. We may stretch these programs over a larger period of time. Some of the things that are a bit more redundant may be phased out along the way. We may see them receive less funding, things like the new air-launched cruise missile. But largely, we've seen Congress very much on board with continuing to fund these programs. It's going to come down to the reality that they're going to have to make some trade-offs and probably fund things a little bit slower along the way. I think where we really get into a major question is if the Trump administration would want to add anything else to this already very large bill. Were you to add something else to this very large bill, the rationale would have to be very strong because it's already quite a lot of money. It's already squeezing out other conventional needs, and the idea of adding something else to it would certainly. Particularly, I would say it would be interesting to consider just in the Trump administration's current budget proposals, were you to progress, or were you to to ask for something that could be potentially politically destabilizing overseas while also cutting large swaths of State Department funding. These are all things that we're going to have to look at as we move forward with the Trump administration's review and their proposals next year, which they've said, they've said that the military buildup that Trump wants is not in this FY18 budget. We'll see that in 19, and so we still have yet to see what that's really going to look like.
Right. So you mentioned the State Department budget. Simon, you served in this role in the State Department. As we see the Trump administration undergoing this nuclear posture review, there have been pretty dramatic events on the world stage. Some have said that the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, which is a cornerstone, is the cliche of global nuclear order, has been wobbling, has been unsettled. There's going to be a new review conference coming up in 2020, and it doesn't seem as though sort of the global nuclear powers or the non-nuclear weapon states have closed ranks or resolved the issues that led to a so-called failure of the previous review conference. Depending on how this NPR goes, what are the consequences for the global nuclear system, and what should we be on the lookout for?
Sure. Thank you, Adam. I wanted to thank you and Brian and Lacey for being here. I think you put together a great panel, and thank you for your report, which I think is the first that I've seen that delves deeply into some pretty complicated topics that are often misused, modernization and new weapons. So thank you for that. I also recognize a lot of former colleagues in the crowd who've been in the space for some time. So before getting straight to your answer, I just wanted to flag a couple things about this debate. I think one of the big risks in these conversations is that you have communities that don't often talk to each other. I think you were insightful in bringing the diplomatic perspective as well here, but oftentimes folks who focus on nuclear weapons don't often think of the other tools of power and the way all this relates to each other and impacts. And I was privileged for a long time to work in that space between diplomacy and nuclear security, so we'll try to bring some of that. I have to confess, Adam, when you invited me to this panel, my first thought was not ethical outrage as I was thinking about where I'd used to be, but more, haven't we seen this movie before? And I think all my outrage was consumed in the early 2000s, dealing with bunker busters and RNEP and assaults on the ban on 5 kiloton R&D. I did, as Adam described, have two sort of phases of my career. One was working for Congresswoman Tauscher, who represented Lawrence Livermore Lab and Sandia, so 2 out of the 3 national labs, and I've had more conversations than I can recall about full funding for the National Ignition Facility. For those of you who are familiar, one of the cornerstones of stockpile surveillance, which is our ability to maintain a credible deterrent without resorting to nuclear testing. I've worked with Rudy Barnes in the audience and his former boss, John Spratt, on protecting the ban on low-yield nuclear weapons, and had conversations, as many of you here, with General Cartwright about the evolving mix between conventional warheads, conventional weapons, and nuclear alternatives, and how that mix can be a credible part of our arsenal. In my second phase, I was able to manage the State Department's non-proliferation assistance programs, and was also, as we're all dual-hatted, involved in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review. And one bit of advice for the new team in the administration: this was the first time that the State Department had a functional role within the Nuclear Posture Review, and the role was to lead the international engagement component of the review. And as you have a lot of experts in nuclear weapons and in deterrence theory and in, on the military side, it is absolutely critical not only to understand the international framework, but also to be able to persuade allies and countries that fall short of being close allies of whatever the new posture is. It doesn't just sell itself on the merits of good writing. as many of you attended and listened to the Carnegie conference where we heard from Chris Ford, who's one of the very few administration officials in place to be able to talk about some of these issues. I would not begrudge the new administration with reviewing a lot of the conclusions of the previous nuclear posture review, but I think there are some concerns that I would have even as we rethink the objective of global zero and working with our allies. Before answering directly your question about where we are, I think diplomatically, because this is an opportunity, I think, publicly to talk about some of these issues. Brian has his favorite parts of the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review. I have certain pages that are my favorites, between pages 9 and 13, where the United States essentially describes our goals of preventing nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism, and talks about leading an expanded international effort to strengthen the global non-proliferation regime and accelerate efforts to prevent nuclear terrorism. It describes priorities like the CTBT, the FMCT, and goes on at some length. This was historic at the time. This was the first time that the non-proliferation and international regimes were mentioned in what is a DoD drafted document, and I would strongly encourage those who are going to consider where our posture is going to take us to preserve that chapter, if not others. So this week's been a busy week, as Adam mentioned. On Monday, the US and Russia held a dialogue between Deputy Secretary Shannon, Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov of Russia, that included New START. There's a commitment that came out of it to hold a future New START bilateral consultative commission and strategic stability talks, which I find very positive. In the same week, the administration certified for the second time Iran's compliance with the JCPOA, which is also a non-trivial achievement of the previous administration that I think continues to bear fruit today, even if it isn't what everybody wants it to be. It is what it was designed to be. On Tuesday, the White House nominated an ambassador to Russia, John Huntsman, or indicated that he would be shortly nominated, and Russia selected their own new ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov. Another important, I think, goal to think about is that the Non-Proliferation Treaty is coming up on its 50-year anniversary. And I think there are many of those, as Adam suggested, that say that it has struggled in some ways, but I would differentiate the value of the NPT in two ways. One, it has struggled from a political perspective, but again, from the perspective of what it was meant to accomplish, it has been a bulwark against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And I'm happy to talk during Q&A about some of the internal dynamics. If you're going to judge the success of the NPT on how many statements were approved at the end of at the conclusion of the various RevCons, then of course that's disappointing. But I would argue that those are not the most important aspects of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review conferences. In fact, there are a number of important initiatives within the NPT that keep coming up and that reflect constituencies within the international community that support a number of important aspects, such as...
So Simon,
please.
There's a theory that you hear repeated frequently that our nuclear force structure has no bearing on international proliferation pressures and dynamics. Is that a theory that you hold to, or how should we think about the effect of this NPR on global non-proliferation leverage?
I'm deeply concerned that we send the wrong signal to a lot of allies and close partners who do the right thing, quote unquote, in the nuclear space, whether it's supporting strong budgets for nuclear security, whether it's working with us on UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea, or on pick your topic. In the chemical security world, I was involved in the Syria chemical weapons removal effort. Those are not relationships that exist in a vacuum. They exist because of US leadership. And the moment we pull back is the moment that countries that have other priorities that in often cases are more important to them, whether it's education, infrastructure, the economy, is the moment that they look at these priorities in terms of non-proliferation as niche issues that the United States cares about and that they don't really need to care about if we're not going to be serious about them ourselves. And so I'm not going to argue that there's a one-to-one relationship between what we do to protect ourselves and what the international community is going to do, but having witnessed former colleagues, my boss, Tom Countryman, Gary Seymour, and others try to create a dialogue with, for example, the BRIC countries, whether it be Brazil or countries like South Africa, and try to get them to do, quote unquote, the right thing in the nuclear security space. I know how hard it is and how reversible a lot of that progress is. So I'm not here to raise enormous concern about a nuclear posture review that hasn't been drafted yet. I'm just concerned about some of the early signals and the fact that a lot of folks who are working on those issues don't take into account some of the strong reversible achievements from the past in the NPT.
Good, thanks. And so, Brian, let me press you quickly on Lacey's view of where we're going on financing and on the fiscal outlook. Are there places where we should look to save money on nuclear triad modernization? What would be can we slip some of these programs? What would be the effect of doing so? Lacey mentioned that we may be headed in that direction, like it or not, but our generals have repeatedly warned that there's very little space there. So what's your view on the financing question?
Sure. If I could first just supplement my first answer about the sufficiency of the deterrent, I left out an important point. The New START treaty allows each side, the United States and Russia, to have up to 1550 strategically deployed warheads. It also puts limits on launchers. It's a curious number, 1550. That was an insistence by the Russians. We wanted 1500, but for whatever reason, they needed another 50. In 2012 and 2013, the Obama administration did a review on its employment strategy, and that culminated in the president's speech in Berlin in 2013, where he announced that because of this review, we could go lower to and reduce our strategic deployed warheads by about 1/3 or around 1,000, and he offered to open negotiations with the Russian Federation toward that end. Nothing happened, and then the events of 2014 and the invasion of Crimea and the intervention in eastern Ukraine and all came to a stop in that category. So the answer to your question is, do we have enough? Is yes, we have more than enough. We can go lower. The question would be whether the administration would choose to do that only through negotiations with the Russians or would seek to do that unilaterally. In terms of your question on the budget and margin, there is not a lot of room for slipping a lot of these programs because many of them have already been slipped quite a lot. The Ohio-class submarine has been extended to the end of its life further than was anticipated. It's going from 30 years of use to 42 for the boats, and the hulls just, at least the engineers tell us this in the Navy, that they can't sustain going any longer than that. So the schedule that's laid out right now for replacing the Ohio-class submarines is the schedule, and there's just not a whole lot of margin for error in that. The replacement for the bomber, the B-21, the cost of that, a lot of the analysis you see in looking at the cost of the nuclear deterrent include the fully loaded cost for the B-21. Secretary Carter, my last boss in the Pentagon, that would drive him bananas because the Air Force wants to buy the B-21 whether it has nuclear capability or not. So if you want to be honest in the accounting, you should look at what are the costs to make it nuclear capable if you're looking at the costs of the nuclear triad. And it's not trivial, but it's not the full cost of the B-21. And then in terms of the ground-based strategic deterrent, the replacement for the Minuteman, that's probably the one that's worth looking at the closest, whether there's any room to sustain it or slip it further. I think the Air Force would say no, but that's worth a hard look. We looked at a lot of this even in the last year. President Obama was very focused on the Prague agenda and what he could achieve even in his final months. And the White House, the NSC, were asking the Department of Defense a lot of questions, the same ones we're discussing here. And I think they'll go through a new round of analysis, but a lot of the analysis was done in the last 6 to 9 months of the administration, looking at that very question.
And so let me give you each panelist a chance to ask questions of the other panelists. Is there anything that you'd like to chime in on or mention as we prepare for questions from the audience?
So then, can you comment on the idea of moving that money, perhaps outside of the specifically for the submarine, moving the money outside of sort of Navy's budget into a defense-wide account, because if there's no room for slippage, particularly when we're looking at that program, then, and let's assume also that Trump does want a 350-ship Navy, where are the trade-offs going to come?
I mean, there's a variant of that that's been created in a previous NDAA. I'm not sure if it still exists, but a Sea Lift Modernization Fund or something
Yeah, it
like
exists.
That.
There's no money in it.
There's no money.
Yeah.
To me, that's just, money is fungible. It's kind of an artifact or a fiction of the budgeting. The budget is the budget. There's $600 billion for the Department of Defense, and you have to decide where you're going to invest in each of the major weapon systems vis-a-vis personnel and day-to-day operations. So creating these special funds is really a political thing that I don't think really makes a difference at the end of the day. The department has a pretty rigorous budget process, much more rigorous than I understood from the outside, that goes through the spring with strategic reviews at looking at issues and making hard, big recommendations, and then starting in the summer all the way to the end of the year, very intensive reviews and trying to find ways to save money and make hard choices. And it gets looked at every year. So it's also, I think a lot of people look at it and say, oh, there are a lot of programs that are on autopilot. But people ask a lot of hard questions. Do we still need to do it this way? We have our own internal OMB, if you will, the Cost Assessment Program Evaluation Office, which, like OMB, has the job of saying no. And they're often asking and doing their own analysis, challenging the services, challenging the rest of OSD, and why are we doing it this way? Do we need to do this? So I can give you some solace. You may not see the results, but there is a lot of rigor to the process. And Vikram, who worked with us in the Pentagon, is nodding his head.
I'm sure there is. So let's turn to questions from the audience. Raise your hands and identify yourself if you don't mind. Yeah, we have a question in the back on the right side.
Thank you very much, Tom Carlino, Plowshares Fund, and thank you all for your presentations, and Adam for a great report and putting on this event, so thank you very much. My question, I think, is for Brian, but others feel free to jump in. I wanted to go back to the Congressman's, which I thought were terrific comments, where he is questioning the need for all of the components of the $1 trillion, $1.2 trillion modernization program, and asking the question, do we need it all? Not do we need any of it, but do we need it all? And I think certainly among his colleagues in the House, that's a pretty wide sentiment to ask the question, do we need it all? When you ask his colleagues in the Senate, I think they feel that way, but then you get the attitude or the sentiment that, well, we agreed to this as part of the New START agreement under the New START Treaty ratification, that we now have to support this program because we supported the deal in New START. My impression is that's not the case because this was a political commitment on the part of President Obama, who is now no longer President Obama. But Brian, I know you were there at the sausage making of all this, and I'm wondering if you could give us your opinion on are certainly Senate Democrats beholden to the deal, or can they question it more aggressively? Thank you.
Sure. Let me start by also going back to something Adam asked about in terms of our adversaries and whether we need to match everything they're doing. I think the general view of the administration and even previous administrations, Bush 43 administration, has always been we don't need to match our potential adversaries or adversaries system for system, yield for yield. need rough strategic parity. The Bush administration's treaty with the Russians, the so-called SORT treaty or the Moscow treaty, had ranges, and so I don't think we need to be precise in matching everything the Russians and the Chinese are up to. In terms of your question, Tom, there were two commitments, or two big commitments that President Obama made. One was focused very intensely, Senator Kyle was the lead person in the Senate, in getting commitments from the President on continuing to invest in Department of Energy production and maintenance facilities and upgrading both the facilities that deal with uranium and plutonium. And a lot of the recommendations at the time had come out of the commission that Jim Schlesinger had co-chaired with Bill Perry. I forget the name of it, Strategic something Commission. Yes.
Yeah.
And so the commitments to that funding were made therein in a report that we submitted to Congress in 2010, and then in some letters or statements the President made around the time of the Senate's approval of New START. Then layered onto that was a commitment I think the President had to make either in a letter before the Senate vote or in the certification after the Senate voted, saying that he was committed to seeking the necessary resources to recapitalize the triad. That's a political commitment. I wouldn't say, I'd have to look at the documents closely, but I guess I would say if I were still working at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for the senior Democratic member, that doesn't tie the hands of the members of the Senate if they want to take another look at whether the triad is necessary or the United States can go to some different construct. I don't think that's a legal restriction on the 100 United States senators today, at least probably 35 of which were not there in 2010.
So let me also put this question to Simon, because you were also there at the inception. The Congress or the Obama administration pledged to carry on modernization as a condition for New START. It was a political commitment. But oftentimes, Congress didn't meet their budget requests for modernization funding, not just for the weapon systems, but especially for infrastructure. Does the Trump administration need a new political commitment or a new sort of political compact with the Hill now that they're undertaking new strategic arms control talks?
So yes, the irony was not lost on me of members of Congress blaming the administration for having an insufficient budget for modernization when the Energy and Water Committee could have easily added more money to our nuclear infrastructure. Is there a need for that New Deal? I think one area, in fact, where the so-called nuclear hawks, I hope I get my terminology correct, and perhaps the rest of the political spectrum can agree objectively, is that there has been this pact in service of national security in a bipartisan way for modernization, perhaps not on the scale that some would like to see. And if you read some of what's come out more recently from the J.D. Crouches and the others who opine on these issues, they would like to protect that core of bipartisanship, both staff and members of Congress that understand the value of investing in that. But I also, for the very reason that Brian just pointed out, there are new members of Congress who don't have a framework or a context to understand what the previous debates and discussions have been in the early 2000s, efforts to repeal the test ban treaty, previous considerations of bunker buster funding, and that conversation. And I don't want to cry wolf, but it can be very persuasive to sit with an aging weapons designer in a room who tells you, I'm increasingly concerned that the Department of Energy and I guess DOD, Brian, correct me, will no longer on an annual basis be able to certify the credibility of the arsenal. Those are things that I heard for a decade, and yet the stockpile surveillance system continues to give us reassurance. So yes, that commitment is necessary, but also I think an education process so that we don't go down the same rabbit holes. And then the last piece, and again, Brian's an expert in this, I observed, correctly or incorrectly in the early 2000s, that we went from threat-based procurement to capabilities-based procurement. And when you're looking at nuclear weapons and capabilities from the capabilities development perspective, it's never enough. But if you're forced to go through some of that logic that Brian described of actually understanding, is there a tried and true military requirement to hold at risk this specific target, you might get a different answer.
One further thing on Lacey's question, which is because we're in this situation where the triad needs to be recapitalized all at the same time, there are certain if a policy decision is made to retain a triad, there are certain upfront investment costs that are required to build the sub, design and build the ICBM, and build the nuclear capability of the aircraft. You don't get a whole lot of savings until the back end when you decide we only want to buy X number versus the original program of record. And even then it's going to be marginal. So if the big money decision is to retain a triad, and if you retain a triad, then you've got certain de minimis investment costs to get the platform.
Sure. Yeah, more questions, please. Yeah, here in the front.
Thank you, Adam. Tad Daly's my name. I'm with Citizens for Global Solutions. Both Simon and Brian mentioned favorite parts of the 2010 NPR. I would like to tell you my least favorite part. And it's the negative security assurances, Brian, that you mentioned. And you threw in this clause at the end, just like the NPR did. We promise not to attack non-nuclear armed nations with nuclear weapons as long as they're in compliance with their non-proliferation obligations. It sounds very sensible, but point one, that had never been part of the conversation about negative security assurances before. Point two, no criteria were given about how that judgment was going to be made. And who was the impartial international observer that would make such a judgment? There wasn't one. It was us. We would be the judge, jury, and executioner. This has been part of the conversation about the NPT from the inception. I've studied this history like a lot of people in this room have. In the 1960s, many of the non-nuclear armed nations said, okay, you want us to promise not to acquire a nuclear deterrent? Promise you won't attack us with nuclear weapons. And it's one of my favorite lines from the history of the nuclear age. Robert McNamara said, quote, "This may be the most reasonable request in the history of international relations." But it's 50 years on almost, Simon, as you said, 2020, and we still haven't really got a pure, unambiguous promise to the non-nuclear states. So I'm not asking you to predict what the Trump administration is going to do, but do any of you have a comment on that? Why can't we, the nuclear-armed nation, say, you don't need nuclear weapons to deter a nuclear attack because we promise you we will not attack you with nuclear weapons?
I mean, I would say just two things. I take your point. It's a valid point. When I look at the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, I look at it in two ways. One is the product of any consensus reached. It's a Pentagon-driven document that incorporates other views, and that necessarily your first priority is to give yourself the space and the commitment to protect the country. But I came at that document and at that process looking at the previous Nuclear Posture Review, which enshrined such concepts of preemptive warfare, preemptive use of nuclear weapons. And by that kind of candlelight or that baseline, it was an awfully better document that for the first time enshrined a lot of other international commitments on the same scale as the commitments we made to our deterrent. So I know I'm not directly answering your question, but I took heart in some of the elements and not all of them. But I'd turn to Brian, who is more closely involved.
Yeah, I was in the Vice President's office at the time, and I'm not remember all the provenance of this language, which probably did come from the Department of Defense. I'm going to guess a little bit, which is always a little bit dangerous. I think what animated the concern at the time was some countries that have significant chemical or biological weapons programs, and it's as much a deterrent warning to them that if we are in a conflict and they use chem or bioweapons, we would hold out the possibility of using nuclear weapons and so therefore the statement is a deterrent. I take your broader point, but I'm not willing to pronounce on behalf of all my former colleagues about whether that was the right choice.
And with that, let's wrap up. Thanks so much for attending on a hot day, and I want to thank my panelists for attending as well.